All right, Yishar Koach, we're getting here for the 7:30 time. We're not yet into the total groove. And so we're back Wednesday night, 7:30 for the tractate of the year, Makkot, in the Or Zarua Beit Midrash. And if you'll recall, last week, we started with the beginning of the daf, Makkot, a little bit of an introduction. Just want to go back through the verses from Deuteronomy that are central to our project right now. I'll read them out loud. The Deuteronomic verses about Eidim Zomamim. Those are the verses we are concerned with. Deuteronomy 19:16 through 21. I'm going to share them on the screen in the English. They are at the beginning of the chapter here in the Steinsaltz. If an unrighteous witness rises up against any man to bear perverted witness against him, the two men between whom the dispute is shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who shall be in those days. And the judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has testified falsely against his brother, you shall do unto him as he conspired to do to his brother. Asher Zamam. And therefore we get the Eidim Zomamim. What they conspired to do, what they schemed to do to their brother, they will have the same done unto them. Now, why do we go from them and not from him? Because as we saw in the Midrash, that was a halachic Midrash, it brought the notion that just like when we talk about witness, what we're really talking about to substantially have testimony in court, we need two witnesses, especially in capital cases. But for all matters, we're going to adjudicate matters that two witnesses really establish testimony. So we made the expanse, with the expansive Perush, the commentary that expands the notion of witness to the two witnesses. And we figure out that there's got to be a system to understand how do we know if this witness or these witnesses is a false set of witnesses. And so that's the Eidim Zomamim halacha that I explained start in Sanhedrin. And that's the Masechet right before Makkot. And Makkot is a continuation of the discussion in Sanhedrin. And there we are for the first Mishna of Eidim Zomamim. And thusly, what are we going to do when we root out this evil of conspiring witnesses? So shall you remove the evil from your midst, and those that remain shall hear and fear, and shall henceforth commit no more such evil in your midst, and your eyes shall not pity. And here's an interesting twist philosophically on the whole project, which we didn't necessarily talk about last time. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So what do you think the force is of the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, when you read that in the Torah? As you go through it, are you only convinced that it means monetary penalties because you've learned somewhere in the coffers of your Jewish education that we went from eye for an eye kind of justice to knasim, to fines and monetary obligations? Or do you think it actually has some other kind of meaning when it comes at the end of such a passage, or could have such a meaning when it comes at the end of such a passage and says to root out the evil of conspiring witnesses who will bastardize the judicial system, as I explained it, and commit conspiracy and try to even capital punishment, even get their fellow Jew killed in the court of law. We do unto them what they conspired to do. You'll root out evil. Everybody will hear it. We have to announce this. Eidim Zomamim will be something we announce out loud, that we have this, because two witnesses can come and really undermine you, and you might pay the big price. So be careful what you try to conspire to do. An eye for an eye, life for a life, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot. Just wonder if that sparks any immediate reaction as to why it's the end of this passage. just to start a conversation tonight before we jump into where we were in the Gemara.
I just, to underscore what you said, is that it's a great warning. I mean, it is, very, very forceful warning. And if I didn't know, because people have told us that this is monetary compensation, I would think that it is meant to, put great fear in you, because you're meant to think that they're going to gouge out your eye and take off your hand.
Right. So it might just, as a youth, especially before your full conception of law, I'm going to build on what, Bobby, you're saying. And I'm going to talk about the education for a society for a minute. If I use rhetoric like this at the end of my passage, which sometimes I like to read the Torah and think about how it falls on young ears, this is really scary stuff. They're going to take my eye out. They're going to cut off my hand. That's kind of in the air, and you hear it read aloud. And then over time, yes, you might hear from someone who's explicating the law that it changes. You might also learn inside how it changes. And you might also, though, with Eidim Zomamim, by the way, have a system of legal ramifications that is about a certain criminal statute that just might lead the rabbis to say, you know what, in this case, it is going to be a life for life. If you conspired to actually have this guy killed, capital punishment, you are going to pay the highest price. And it's going to be any death available. We don't know the experts around. We don't have the expert around to do the sreifa, the burning. Well, we're gonna actually allow for Eidim Zomamim any methodology of capital punishment that we have in the system that's on the books. Right? That's what they said about Eidim Zomamim in Sanhedrin, which is really scary stuff. So it's going to really make me have a different kind of respect for the legal system if I hear life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and then they even find some cases where they're willing to punish you for it exactly the same way that you conspired or you schemed against your fellow man over there. So that, I think, is there. Any other idea as to why the end there? Life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? Ron, I couldn't hear you. I don't know what's going with your sound.
I think it is because it's the basic judgment by God written in the Bible on the first time that this issue was raised.
Good. So maybe it's godly law, and then you have to figure out what to do with that law, right? Is that what you're suggesting? Or maybe I'm taking it one step further. You're talking about it being godly legislation, and what do we then have to do with godly legislation, right? That's the level that I'm going to take it to, noting what you said. And the reason why I'm going to put it in that way is because of a brilliant idea by the scholar Devorah Steinmetz. There is this wonderful book I told you we were going to look at sometimes this time around, Punishment and Freedom, by Devorah Steinmetz, The Rabbinic Construction of Criminal Law. And this scholarly work suggests, and Dale, I see your hand up, so I'll get to you in just a moment, that God gave us law, as Ron just said. And I'm going to come back to this idea with a little bit of text that we're going to look at. God gave us law. It came from Sinai, and therefore, in the sense of legal systems, it's a positive Sinaitic legal tradition. There are prescriptions, it's divine, and thusly, you think that it has to be administered exactly the way God said it should be administered, right? However, what's brilliant about Chazal, says Dr. Steinmetz, what's brilliant about rabbinic law is that the rabbis, the sages, are humble before Sinai, before the positivistic Sinaitic legal system, and in their ability to bring their own humanity and their own system of hermeneutical interpretation, meaning they come up with a system whereby they really are able to interpret divine law. They humbly shape statutes, systems, and approaches to law, philosophical approaches and new statutory approaches to law that respect the Sinaitic divine reality and yet express the human capacity, the free will, the moral agency that we must, as legal decisors in any particular time or generation, which is brilliant. It's a brilliant way of saying that we never lost the notion that law is from Sinai, but we also have this notion of what's law ought to be, what law should be, given our considerations of very, very treasured values and the aspiration of morality that comes within law. And so the way she says it is that the thesis is that the design of criminal, for instance, execution, and the description of the procedures that lead to the violator of the law being condemned to punishment express a particular understanding of law and a violation of law. That's an extreme positivist conception of law. Conception of law is based exclusively in the command of the lawgiver. But the rabbis are aware of alternative conceptions of law, and the rabbis' insistence on the positive nature of Sinaitic law and their conception of sin and punishment in relation to the conception of law is related to notions of human freedom and self-determination, and of human action and interpretation, I'll add, and codification, I'll add, as redemptive of the world and the self, and I would add of the divine law that was granted. So as a concept, I'll come back to that in a couple of places. I will come back to that as we read to see that the rabbis are trying deeply to respect the system of law. And this expression, though, that they have some regard of self-determination and how we approach any given law, really we have control. They'll look at it and they'll talk about not only just exceptions to the rules, but the reason why we have certain exceptions, and we make certain exceptions, and we talk about whether or not the punishment fits with this category of law, hazama, edim zomamim, or we simply see it as other kind of alternative sentencing. The reason why we categorize things is to either honor a certain category of Torahitic Sinaitic law, which is that positive Sinaitic law that I must respect, or I know consciously that I'm breaking with that in a certain way that still yet respects the divine roots and origins of the whole legal system. So that's going to be a recurring theme in the way that we see this unfold. Dale.
I'll make my comment, but I want to come back to what you said. The way it's placed, if I'm reading the Deuteronomy correctly, it's the witnesses, the false witnesses, who get this harsh punishment.
Correct.
Not necessarily the criminal.
No, the accused is to be exonerated because the false witnesses tried to condemn him, but they were untruthful and they were conspirators.
So if somebody accidentally or on purpose takes somebody's eye, he may be have a monetary, if he's convicted, he may be asked to pay, but it sounds like it's the false witnesses who try to convict him who get their eye taken out. And
by
they
the
haven't
way,
proven him, even though they're false, the guy may still be guilty. We don't know that.
well, here's the thing. What we assume from this case is not that the guy's had his eyes poked out inadvertently and that the other guy's on trial for taking out his eye. We, in this case, given the Torah's verses here in Deuteronomy, have a very specific case of somebody who didn't have anything happen to him get accused by a pair of witnesses, and not just one, because we've expanded that through the Sifri that we looked at last time, and that two other witnesses, and we're going to learn how the Torah explains this case even further and why we're able to really understand that this was the case that's in question versus, say, when something happens and we have witnesses come to testify that so-and-so is guilty for what happened. So here we have a witness problem, and the two witnesses are brought forward to say these witnesses that are establishing testimony that we thought established it because two witnesses would and could, that we even examined them, and even in our examination, we felt that they were trustworthy. But now we're going to undermine that because two other witnesses come and say, no way could they have been truthful because they were with us when they saw such and such happen, or that they testified about such and such. That's the case that we're dealing with, and the guy hasn't necessarily on the stand, or if you will, the plaintiff hasn't been harmed yet. Nothing has happened to that.
No, I understood that, but I'm trying to address the question of whether this really means an eye for an eye. And there's nothing that says that had this guy been convicted for having taken somebody else's eye out, this doesn't apply to that case. And so we don't know that the punishment is always the same as the crime. What we're reading here is that being a false witness is so bad that we will do these physical things to you if you are a false witness.
Good. Yes, I understand now your clarification.
But then I wanted to make sure I understood what you're saying about what Devorah Steinmetz said.
Yeah.
If I have this right, it's saying that the rabbis felt that they were allowed to change Torah Sinai as long as they in some way gave it the proper respect. Is that a somewhat close to what she's saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's more nuanced than that. They insist on the positive nature of Sinaitic law, meaning that there is divine law. A la Ron says, this is what God says is the application of the law. This is the law, this is the application of the law. However, they have their own conception of sin and punishment, and in some cases, there's going to be self-determination. So the application of Sinaitic law may sometimes cause us to question, is this just a change for change's sake? What is their motivation for changing the law that seems so straightforwardly, right? Opposite sometimes even a verse in Torah. We're going to get to some cases later that make mention of laws that seem pretty straightforward on the books of Torah, and yet the rabbinic systems kind of upend the established law as it's given in Torah. So is that respect or is that a belief? And I think this is where Dr. Steinmetz goes with it. She believes that the rabbis were self-aware in their notion of rabbinic power to make law as a corollary of their understanding of the bigger system of Sinaitic law, so that they have a systems approach within the Sinaitic law canon, if you will, or the entire code of Sinaitic law. And sometimes what might seem a direct change just out of respect for God, you had a certain hermeneutic and you did it a certain way, that it goes beyond that, that it's a rabbinic belief in human autonomy, the freedom of rabbinic decision-making, and their understanding of the whole corpus of Sinaitic law that allows them to be a little bit flexible, if you will, or into changing things to use straightforward language, or into a systemic reevaluation of laws that seem pretty straightforward, but don't get ruled exactly in that way. Okay, is that a little bit more of a nuanced way of saying it?
Yes, that was clear. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So let's push on into some text where we left off. We heard that the Mishna said, well, how do you determine if witnesses are conspiring witnesses who scheme against their brother? And then the Mishna presents a case about problems with applying, you shall do unto them, the witnesses, what they scheme to do to him, the one they accused. And what's the first problem? It's with the son of a Cohen who married a divorcee. And he's not going to become a Cohen in his life, the son, because he's what's called a halal. He's now emptied of the rank of Cohen. He can't serve in the way the Kohanim serve. Now, the guy himself, the father, who was accused of marrying the divorcee, he doesn't have a status change. Just the son has a status change. And so the rabbis argue, Eila lokei arba'im, we're going to have Makkot, we're going to have lashes, instead of saying that the witnesses are turned into either the Cohen who had nothing happen to him, or the son who is now emptied of his rank. And then the Mishnah kind of says, well, really it would be about what we had hoped to accuse him of, which is just the father. And since his rank didn't change and there wasn't an actual change in his status, it only affected the son, how could you argue that there's any change in them at all? And finally, again, back to the ruling of the Mishnah, shouldn't we give them lashes instead of changing their status anyway, so that there's still a punishment, is the kind of attitude that we saw within the text itself. And we asked the question whether or not, as the Gemara did, is it still hazama? Is it still an application of the law under the rubric of Eidim Zomimim, under the rubric of conspiring, scheming witnesses? If I give them lashes and I don't have a punishment that looks exactly like the sentence that he hoped would get thrust onto the man he accused. And so the workout is first with this case of the divorcee and the whole status of the Kohanim. And what I want to suggest to you, because we're going to pick up with the other case here about someone being liable to exile, which is a rabbinic way of saying he's manslaughtered someone and he's got to be sent to the city of refuge that is available for the purpose of having a manslaughterer run away and not be killed by a goel damim, by someone who's looking for blood justice. So before that, the first case we want to notice was a case of this whole Kohenic status before we get to manslaughter. And when it came to lashes, the first punishment we talked about was conspiring witnesses against a guy whose Kohenic status, or at least his impact on Kohenic status, is really at stake. And I want to notice something about that. We could have started with manslaughter. We could have gone right from Sanhedrin into the rule of, well, it wasn't exactly murder, it's manslaughter, and he's actually obligated to be sent to a city of refuge. And what do you do when you have conspiring witnesses in that case? Conspiring witnesses, even when it comes to our priestly class, even when it comes to ritual matters, which you might not take as seriously as the loss of life, you must have a certain consciousness about all these matters that, and this is to say it as squarely as I'm going to say it, even though you could push back a little on this. The matter of someone's status as a Kohen is a life and death matter. The matter of someone serving God and serving the Jewish people and presenting sacrifice and granting atonement and leading you through ritual and really having the moment of being able to help you get past that moment that you needed, Yom Kippur to everyday Yom Yom. The Gemara, in my opinion, and this is where like the literary read, why does the Gemara start with what it starts with? What do we glean from this placement of this first part of the Mishnah and this discussion? Ritual, bein adam lamakom, which is what we call between human beings and heaven, is being said first before we get to bein adam lachavero, between human beings, and about manslaughter and murder. And the witnesses in either case, bein adam lachavero stands out as the philosophical and legal issue. So I don't have to only think about it as the Kohen is the first issue and manslaughter is the second issue. What I'm really interested in on the legal front is how two individuals can truly deceive the judges, the priests, and their fellow citizens. And when I want to deceive someone, if I am first willing to deceive the priests and the judges and God, alachat kam v'kama, I'm willing to deceive someone about my neighbor, right? If I'm so bold as to deceive the entire court system and the officers of the court and the religious figures and people who it seems like there's a little bit more gravitas to the issue when I try to deceive them, then of course I'm going to try to deceive my neighbor. Of course I'm going to try to conspire and scheme against them. So I think the Gemara, in a very deep way, sets us up a second option with the Kohen first to say, these conspiring witnesses did it even to the priests and before God, and now watch what happens when they do it to fellow human beings, and they go further with the human being and they say that he was a manslaughterer and they want him to be sent to the city of refuge. By the way, again, Sanhedrin, we already knew that they tried to scheme about a murder case, but we're back to it and we're mixing it all up now with how we deceive and upend status and legal status within the bein adam lamakom world between God and human beings. And we also try to upend a lot vis-a-vis bein adam lachavero. And it's a whole mess because of the willingness of these eidim zomin, these conspiring witnesses, to really do evil, which has to be rid from the community, as the Torah said in Deuteronomy, which we read. Okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to pick up, after this whole issue of the priests, we're going to pick up with the next section of the Gemara about someone who's liable to exile, meaning that these two witnesses come and they are testifying that this guy, this one we're accusing, is liable to exile, obviously because of a manslaughter that happened. I'm going to now share the screen again. Okay, so here we go. Me'i din anu ba'ish ploni shehu chayav galut. Now, what's interesting about this language, just to point it out, and Makkot is a place in the next chapter we're going to deal with a lot about the cities of exile. Very interesting whole reality there about how that whole system of punishment works and what we expect in terms of that system. But these witnesses come and they say so-and-so is liable to exile, galut. Now, galut, interestingly enough, for people who follow the kind of philology of the Talmud, Galut is a term that is generally refers to the exile of, like in Jeremiah chapter 20, he says the Galut to Bavel, the Golah, not even Galut, Gimel Vav Lamed Hey. And the whole notion of the development of Golin and exile someone and Galut in this usage, this is a rabbinic construct, which is fascinating. I have to tell you that I had a wonderful kind of moment of, you kind of feel like in the Jewish world sometimes that you're holding and you're learning in a certain tractate, and the whole world is, if you do Daf Yomi, you're in tractate Rosh Hashanah right now, so no one's with us in Makkot. And I don't know who else out there is learning Makkot right now, but I saw on Facebook this morning, someone asked a question about Mishna 2, chapter 2, Mishna 1 of Makkot on a group that I'm in on Facebook. And I got to interact in this virtual Beit Midrash for a second, saying, I was just looking at that root and thinking about a verse in Jeremiah from which I wanted to take some inspiration that the language of exile was really about going against God's words. And I saw in this verse from Jeremiah, it said, you know, anybody who listens to God's word, but then went against it, they're going to be exiled. And so it sounds like in that one verse from Jeremiah, of course, and that's talking about the Babylonian exile, but it also has resonance with the whole framework of the way the rabbis create an exile from Jerusalem to one of these cities of refuge that you have to take refuge in, like Babylonia was our refuge for a while until we got back to Israel. So I'm making this drush on Jeremiah, pushing the envelope with some kind of finding it in Torah. And this person is wondering about the philological roots of the verb and how it's used in the Mishnah. And we had what I call a holy Facebook moment. This was a holy Facebook moment. No, no crazy divisive politics, just building understandings of sacred text in the Gemara to try to understand, what do we do with conspiring witnesses? And what do we do as a society? Manslaughter happens. Manslaughter happens. And so we really have to face all of this. And this helps us face it all. And a person needs atonement. And therefore the cities of refuge are established in Torah, but it's really, you're exiled there to figure out how to reconnect with God's good world. And how to, we kind of advance a system where blood revenge is taken out of the equation, and at least the person lives in one of these cities of refuge until, by the way, we're going to get to it, the high priest dies and everybody's free. And that's the system. But in our case here, at the beginning of Makkot, back to the focal point of conspiring, scheming witnesses. And what do we do when they say manslaughter? This guy committed a manslaughter. He killed someone and now he's liable for exile. And menahani mili. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this matter? How do we know this was a case that we have to contend with vis-a-vis wrong-headed witnesses, conspiring witnesses, scheming witnesses, and someone who's really not guilty of that reality? And how do we know that when they are discovered as conspiring witnesses in this case, that they're not going to be exiled themselves? Instead, they're going to get lashes, because that was what our Mishnah said. Look up here. I hope you can follow as I scroll back through. Our case was in the Mishnah, Me'idinanu ba'ish ploni shehu chayav liglot. We testify with regard to so-and-so that he's liable to be exiled to a city of refuge. But when it's discovered that they are Eidim Zomamin and they've conspired and schemed against their brother, Ein omrim yigle ze tachtav. We don't say that the conspiring witnesses actually are sent to exile in those cities of refuge. Ela, what do we do instead? Loke arba'im. We administer 40 lashes as their punishment. So that was the case in the Mishnah. And minahani mili, where do we learn this from? How do we know that in the case of exile that you don't actually send the Eidim Zomimim to the city of refuge, but you actually administer lashes? Amar Reish Lakish, de Amar Kra. Reish Lakish says, it's derived from a verse, Hu Yanus el Achat He'arim. Hu velo Zomimim. Reish Lakish is going to teach us something about what happens in this particular case, because the verse about a manslaughterer says Hu Hey Vav Aleph, and it's about him, the one who did the manslaughter. He will actually be exiled to one of those cities of refuge. They now make a strong limud, a midrashic limud, a halachic paring of the verse. Who velo zomamim? Only the guy we're really talking about, the manslaughter himself, gets sent to the city of exile, not Eidim Zomamim, not the witnesses who schemed against him. In their case, we administer lashes. Rabbi Yochanan Omer, but Rabbi Yochanan comes and says, I don't learn it specifically from that verse. This is a classic way that the Gemara tries to understand a question about mina hane mili. I offer one explanation. In this case, it's actually a named source, Reish Lakish. And now I go to Rabbi Yochanan. And by the way, what a pair Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan are. Just hold that thought for a minute, and we'll get back to those sages, because they are our first named sages in the tractate. And I want to make something of that. I want to just note that for a second, and I want to make something of that, and I want to learn something from that. And I think it's really kind of a cool thing to look at. Who are the sages on the pages, and what do we know about them? And being that they're first, in this case, I think it says something. But meanwhile, Rabbi Yochanan is going to say, I learn it from a kal v'chomer. I learn it from this kind of, well, if this is the case, then for sure that's the case, right? What is a kal v'chomer? In this case, umashehu she'asa maseh b'mezid eino gole hen shelo asu maseh b'mezid eino din shelo yiglu. If the killer who performed an action that he had done so intentionally would not be exiled. In other words, if I have a murderer who committed murder intentionally, he does not get exiled to a city of refuge. Or even like this, he had done so intentionally, he would not be exiled for it, even if he were not sentenced to death, because there was no forewarning. The one who didn't perform the action, they're not killers. They're just witnesses who conspired against their brother. And as their conspiracy came to light, because two other witnesses came into the court and said, could never be, because those witnesses were with us, even if they had testified intentionally, meaning we know they conspired intentionally, isn't it logical that they should not be exiled? So Rabbi Yochanan wants to say that sometimes you have to look at the instance of what these guys' intention really was about. And the conspiring witnesses did this deliberately and intentionally. And if a killer who performed an action that, had he done so intentionally, oh, so now we're talking about this guy who is potentially the manslaughterer because he's accused to be a manslaughterer. And had he done it intentionally, he wouldn't be exiled because there was some procedural default, meaning he didn't get any warning and he really didn't think that the whole package was, the court, in other words, has no way of sentencing him to death penalty. And he for sure wouldn't get exiled because not all of the requirements of the capital case are met. If that's the case, those who had intentionally created conspiracy and their testimony is now rejected because of the second set of witnesses, if they did it intentionally, I'm going to say that logically, they shouldn't be exiled either. Bottom line, I have a guy who's accused of manslaughter by these witnesses who's supposed to be exiled. Rabbi Yochanan says, but if he would have even done the killing act intentionally, but he didn't receive a warning, which is required, meaning that if I want to sentence someone to death for a capital crime, I not only have to have two witnesses who saw him do it intentionally, I have to know that they gave him a warning and that he completely rejected their warning and then went ahead and intentionally killed. And I don't exile him. The result of that action, if he killed and there was never a warning given, is that I don't even exile him. Basically what? What happens to that guy? He's exonerated because I don't have enough of the evidentiary requirements met. The conspiring witnesses who do so intentionally, what we say about them is that logically, we can't exile them because of the intention that they actually brought to the issue. Originally, the manslaughter would have to be done unintentionally in order for the person to be exiled. So Rabbi Yochanan is trying to use some type of logical thinking here to figure out exactly why we don't send the conspiring witnesses to the city of refuge. Whereas Reish Lakish had a simpler version. The verse said it was him, the manslaughterer, who is sent to the city of refuge, and not the Eidim Zomamim. And since it said who, just the man who is the manslaughterer, we give lashes to the Eidim Zomamim, and we understand why they get lashes from that perspective. Rabbi Yochanan is not convinced that he can learn it from that verse. He wants to use some type of logic in here that thinks about who did what intentionally, whether or not the punishment given intention would ever really happen. And since it doesn't happen for the killer, even who intentionally killed, no punishment happens if he wasn't forewarned. And these guys who did something intentionally, the punishment never happens because they did it intentionally. And we know now the lashes happen because they weren't exiled to a city of refuge. And these guys who conspired aren't going to be exiled to a city of refuge because they did it intentionally. So we need a punishment. And that punishment is 40 lashes. Now, which one do you like better? And, do we have to figure out why the exception for conspiring witnesses, in this case, that they don't get exiled to a city of refuge and get the exact same punishment that they tried to have sentenced to this guy they accuse? What do we do with the fact that they don't have the same punishment and that they get lashes? Yeah, Ron, what were we going to say?
I think the whole situation is completely different based on the story in the Bible. If somebody killed somebody, who nas el ir miklat, nas means he ran away quickly to a city of refuge to avoid nikmat dam, that somebody else from the family will kill him immediately. There is no court, there is no judgment, there is no bedin. If you killed somebody and you didn't run away quickly to ir miklat, you are dead by the brother of that guy. So the uyanus has nothing to do with Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan takes something that is not connected to the reality of the case. Uyanus means that guy, even if he's right, he's wrong. If he's not in Ir Miklat, he's dead 2 minutes later. So the whole story of supporting of Uyanus and they don't, because they are the Edim Zomimim, has no connection to the reality of the case.
Rabbi Yochanan is talking about intention versus unintentional. Like intentional versus unintentional. What it boils down to is this. Rabbi Yochanan is interested in whether or not exile can atone at all for what crime was committed. He says about the manslaughterer who did it unintentionally, exile can atone. But even if he did it intentionally and he wasn't warned, he's not going to be exiled. Exile will never be the answer for him because he did it intentionally. If he does it unintentionally, that could atone for the sin. But if he did it intentionally, he's not exiled, even if he's thrown out of court because he didn't have all of the standards of evidence met. He's found not guilty, but he's not exiled. These guys who intentionally tried to incriminate this other guy in court, a city of refuge will never exonerate them, never atone, because they did it intentionally. So I think that he's really thinking about intention versus the nature of the unintentional killing. And that's what I think it boils down to. But thank you, your comment made me see the clarity, I think, of Rabbi Yochanan's position. Anybody else about Rabbi Yochanan's position here? Because I know it was a workout. I did some acrobatics there with my articulation of the passage.
Yeah. I have a problem with the logic. You said something about he wasn't warned. Why would a person have to be warned? Don't you know that you can't kill somebody? I don't understand the logic on that. Shlakish is much simpler and logical,
Right.
And this is very convoluted.
It was convoluted a little bit because of my workout, so I beg your indulgence. I was just going through this Kal V'chomer again, trying to get down to the deeper realities of not only the case but the Rabbi Yochanan's thinking and the convolution. That element that you're talking about, Ari, really comes from the rabbinic systems approach of capital punishment. And that is, we require not only witnesses to be really examined and threatened even. Remember, I told you the verb about capital witnesses was ayaminotam. Like we threaten them with how serious this is. And if you're going to testify as to a capital case, you got to be really sure. But we learn out in Sanhedrin that in order for us to be able to impose the death penalty, we require that we warn a person about the consequences of their action. Don't you know that if you go through with this, you're going to face the death penalty? And if we don't do that, and they don't know the law, then we can't administer a death penalty. We can't convict. Now, that may not be agreeable to an advocate of the death penalty because they think that it is a good system vis-a-vis a prohibitive system of justice, or at least retributive. But we require that because we're so concerned that we should have a legal system that basically invokes the death penalty pretty much at will for someone who goes through with these types of murders. And they have a lot of struggle and trouble with the whole system. So they create a lot of boundaries for actually administering capital punishment.
I think that maybe I'll go off a little bit on the tangent, but I think the fundamental difference is whether or not you've shed blood, which category you're going to wind up in. The minute you shed blood, it's got to be expiated, and either by the next of kin killing the murderer, or by this ingenious system of the cities of refuge. But that's a really very fascinating structure and concept and development of an equivalence of expiation, because really, that goes back to Cain and Abel, and the fact that it's the ground that calls out, and that's something you have to deal with, because otherwise the world is not in order. Here, because you don't have the shedding of blood by this conspiracy, you're somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that gives them a fair amount of freedom here. And it may also be that they're not eager to have that construct of the city of refuge used for anything else, because they need to keep the Torah focus on that. If you start playing around with who else winds up in the city of refuge, you can really be opening up Pandora's box. So I think there's an attempt here to avoid the overuse of that very peculiar and structure that I think is in the Torah. So we know that it's a reflection of the most fundamental values. My problem with all of this is I'm not sure how they conceive of the severity of these punishments. And it's very hard for me to develop in the sense of the equivalence. But most importantly, I must say, over the week, I was just commenting to Bobby, what really troubles me about all of this is that you're taking God's creation and you're about to inflict not just pain on it, but you're going to compromise its integrity. You're going to wind up with welts and sores and a variety of other things that, if you ask me which of the Torah verses I would be using to introduce this, the first one would be, man is made in God's image. And from that, we have derived a whole social order in Western civilization about the integrity of the human and the human body, and the respect that it requires. So the idea of a punishment that inflicts damage to that body, I haven't seen yet where that comes from. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth comes from the Torah, but that's in response to a violation. of the equivalent. But here, what we're up against is a non-equivalence in which we're about to inflict a physical harm. So again, I apologize for the digression, but those are my thoughts.
Good. So we didn't do a background into the exact punishment that comes up as we have moved forward. I did not necessarily address that nature of the questions of corporal punishment. And if we do start with Barry, your verse, just to take that part of what you said, and I appreciate the rest of what you offered, but okay, let's for a second hang there and consider this now. Because, right, now we have two cases where we have lashes as the alternative to some type of status change, right? Because we suggested that maybe those guys, they should have been ineligible to make a minyan, right? In passing, I said last time, like, wouldn't it have been creative to say, just like they tried to create a status change in the guy and in the children of the Kohen, we should figure out some kind of parallel system to, okay, for maybe a year, you get that punishment, or 10 years, you can't be part of the quorum of 10. I don't know. But meanwhile, it was lashes that become the punishment. And here again, you might think that the expiation that's possible in a city of refuge could be used to offer expiation for the Eidim Zomamim. Let's say they were even found guilty of Hazama, as we have said, right? The Eidim Zomamim, that they did conspire, they were discovered to be in a conspiracy. Shouldn't we be able to say, no, let's send them to the city of refuge so that they serve out their sentence and expiation is achieved, atonement is achieved? Why do we use lashes? Now, the Gemara actually in the last part of our section, with a little bit of, again, Gemara type of logic, will ask, why not let the Eidim Zomamim be exiled? Because that's what they really tried to establish happen to this guy who they accused. And what it says is, let them be exiled so that they will have atonement. And the Gemara concludes a little bit more like Ari, what you said, Ela mechkavrata k'deresh Lakish. Rather, we figure it's like Reish Lakish. The guy himself, if he was a manslaughter, would have been sent there. But these Eidim Zomamim, no, the city of refuge can't afford them the kind of atonement they need. And I'm not going to try to justify the lashes as the body being so bludgeoned and bloodied and all that would come with 40 lashes with someone who knows how to really administer this punishment. But I will tell you what we're to understand, at least from these couple of verses in Torah. And let me just share the screen, since you brought this up now, Barry. Here's what it says in Devarim 25. Ki yeriv bein anashim v'nikshu el mishpat ushfatum v'hitzdiku et hatzadik v'hirishiu et harasha. When there's a dispute between parties and they go to the law and a decision is rendered declaring the one in the right and the other in the wrong, bin hakot harasha v'hipilo v'hashofet v'hikahu lefanav kedei rishato b'mispar. The guilty one then is to be flogged. The magistrate shall have the person lie down and shall supervise the giving of lashes by count as warranted by the offense. Arba'im yakenu lo yosif. The maximum penalty is up to 40 lashes. Pen yosif hakoto al ele makaraba v'nikla achicha le'enecha. The guilty one may be given up to 40 lashes, but not more, lest being flogged further to excess, your peer be degraded before your eyes. So there is some recognition that beyond 40, the guy is really before your eyes degraded to such a level that you forget that he's created in the image of God, to use your language. Now, you might argue that just doing it more than once, symbolically, is a degradation of the image of God. Lo tachsom shor b'disho. And by the way, the next verse is be kind to animals and make sure that they can eat while they're grazing. Just so that there's a level of compassion within the Psukim, a level of compassion to God's animals. And if you remember, where else is God compassionate to both human beings and animals, all in the same little ending of a book? We saw that in Sefer Yonah. We saw that in the book of Jonah, that when they made tshuva and sat in sackcloth, God was merciful to the cattle, just like God was merciful to the people. Yet, the Torah explicitly in those verses in chapter 25 really outlined a system of punishment that the rabbis are exploring. Now, this also gets into something that scholars of the legal tradition, everybody from Louis Finkelstein to Devor Steinmetz, has really said about the Jewish legal tradition. Is it all here as it was? Is it an exercise in understanding the administration of the law as Torah wrote it? And did we really ever have courts that administered corporal and capital punishment, or is it only kind of in our own corridors of the proverbial Beit Midrash before they were major yeshivas in exile in Babylonia and centers of Jewish learning? All these questions stand, and I'll just add another dimension to that question, or those questions in our time. Were we so perplexed and even repulsed, as Barry, you didn't use, did you use the word repulsed? I don't know. But are we so shocked at the nature of true law as we study it in Torah and then through Sanhedrin and in Makkot and in these tractates that we only can ask, did they ever really do this? Because I think sometimes that the scholarship starts from the premise where you began to reflect on how could we possibly see that the Jewish people would administer this law. That is to say, Devor Steinmetz has a very interesting kind of, I think, way of appreciating the rabbinic development of law with more and more and more levels of compassion and restraint. She says they respect the Sinaitic traditions. They respect chapter 25 of Deuteronomy. But they do so with a broad vision and version of creating law that understands that verse that comes after the 3 about lashes is like, be compassionate to your animals. Oh, I could say in legal terms, that's a law about animals, and this is a law about human beings. But what I learn, if I'm serious about what we glean from the whole system coming together and working together, is that compassion has to be worked into our legal system. In addition, like with the question Ari asked, with the capital system, I should be so bold as to mechaye umemi. I should be so bold as to be the one to give life and to take life. We make a great potential for procedural default to happen. Procedural default is the term that prosecutors ultimately fall victim of themselves, and that is they don't really acquire all the right evidence. They don't really present it. They don't really do evidentiary procedure or the kind of discovery in the right way. The defense lawyer comes and says, because there was procedural default, my client can't be sentenced to death. Well, that is an ideal within our systems of law. And so, especially when it comes to capital, and I would even say corporal. And so here you have the debate whether or not they lashed guys because they conspired. We have to ask the question, what's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth doing there? Let's go back to the beginning, the verses we read from Deuteronomy. Here's another take on why those verses are there. Because if I brought you into Perek HaChovel, if I brought you into Bava Kama, which is at the outset of Seder Nezikin, this whole section of Talmudic tractates regarding civil and criminal law, what I establish in the 8th chapter of Bava Kama is that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, really means monetary penalties, especially in civil cases. Even when I damage my friend physically with violence, cut off a limb, I have money to think about as a potential way of really administering an alternative sentence as opposed to lashes, which, by the way, will come into focus in the Gemara we're about to read. And so I think that the next section that actually suggests that there are some monetary penalties for when witnesses are considered to be false witnesses and conspiring against their friends upends some of the desire to make good on the Torah law to administer lashes. That was my way of getting there.
So maybe just, I see Dale has a hand up, but I just want to put in one other thought that does cross my mind, and that is, if you put somebody in a city of refuge, you're not just punishing them, you're punishing everybody who depends upon them to make a living. And I really wonder,
Family.
yes, well, I'm saying, so you're punishing the whole family, whereas if you administer 40 lashes and they're out for a week or whatever it takes to recover, then the breadwinner is back, or theoretically back.
Yeah. So you do have to weigh those kinds of things. And by the way, taking the labor out of the house is a major consideration in ancient times, and probably one of the underlying reasons why you have some monetary reality attached to brides moving into husbands' domains. And a lot of it has to deal with labor, not that she's sold like chattel in our system, but that there's like this transfer of thinking about money, because a woman who could be of so much value in her family for the family business, whatever that business happens to be, the work of the house and or the business that's going on. So some of that is inherent in this system, and we'll need to keep that in mind too as we move into next passages of our Gemara. Dale.
Both of you in different ways are trying to get away from the idea of lashes. But I've read that the Vilna of Gaon of Vilna had people lashed. So I have no trouble at all believing that in biblical times or in Talmudic times, where there weren't prisons, that would have been a punishment that was used. I don't see a need to make it go away. I will say that on the eye for an eye, if there's money involved, then the person who was harmed gets some recompense. Whereas if you take out the eye of the person who took out the eye, that does nothing for the person who was harmed originally. So they're different. They're in different spheres of what kind of punishment you would be looking at, depending on whether you're talking about harm that was done to a person or harm that wasn't done to, in the end, was not done to the person, but was done to the court.
Well, the ideals of fairness that come from an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and the whole notion of how it scares people in society, and it stands there to say, don't do this because it will happen to you. I do think it's very different than the monetary recompense or the compensation that is paid, and the fines and the additional fines that sometimes get added on, and the penalty, then the sting of that reality. And in agricultural societies where money is really, really sometimes scarce, It could be a very big nut, the kind of fine you're talking about. So it could be just as scary, but it represents something a little different and vis-a-vis livelihood. You're right. On the other hand, I do, even though you might have read about the Vilna Gaon, and there are some over time who definitely advocate for more quote unquote violence inherent in the system, and to use punishments that are biblical, and that we wouldn't be surprised to find some of them administered. You can see in the text here that yes, as of right now, we're holding with lashes versus any status change for the guy the witnesses who tried to conspire against the Kohen. And we're holding with lashes versus sending these Eidim Zomamim to a city of refuge. However, remember the procedure of actually proving that these Eidim were Zomamim, and the kind of oaths and the kind of commitment that witnesses make within the system is so serious. And the rabbi's discussion about whether or not the punishment can really be administered at all because there was not, or there was a kiyum, like did they really affect anything or not by just making the accusation? Should we do anything because they really didn't change anything? This is a constant question of the text. And that question, philosophically, I think is a real deep question of whether or not we're really talking about the administration of these lashes, or we just have it on the books as the penalty. He really didn't change the status of the guy who was a husband of divorcee. He really didn't change the status of the two sons into a halal. They can still serve as Kohanim and eat their truma. He was not discovered to have married a divorcee. And thusly, no real change was effected. Do we really now lash them? Well, on the books we do, but did they really do we really say that anything really happened? And there's the philosophical undercurrent of the tractate is, if nothing really happens and no change really happened, are we really going to lash them? And that's by a lot of Rishonim, and we don't have time to go into the particular texts themselves, but we have a lot of Rishonim verses, like say Vilna Gaon. We have a lot of questions as to whether or not these lashes were really administered, because maybe there's no maisa, there's no kiyum, there's no real active kind of change in the first case, or exile in the second case. There's just nothing except the false testimony. And now the next conversation of the Gemara is going to happen, if I can push on to some more text and say, what's that?
I did have a question before you. I don't want to interrupt your sentence, but I didn't want to quite yet.
I'll get back to it.
Okay, so I don't understand whether the Talmud, in talking about monetary, exchanges or whatever it's called, are they introducing something new? So before this is written in the Talmud, was there a time when it was literally an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, or when there was more lashing? And what we are getting is a new and more generous and less violent way of dealing with it written down in the Talmud? Or is this representing what has been happening for a long, very, very long time from the beginning? Or is it representing a way of ameliorating or lessening what had been practiced?
Okay, so the rabbis want to make it really clean system and say that lashes are for all lo taisa, for all lo ta'aseh mitzvot, for any you thou shalt nots that have been violated, okay? But Robert Alter points out something very different, and that Robert Alter's comment on these verses that we looked at about the lashes says the corporal punishment would either be lashes or blows delivered with a rod or a cane. They did happen. However, biblical law is reticent about what infractions merited this punishment, mentioning only the instance of a man who defames his wife. Now, I find that to be incredible, because I've heard Professor Alter speak about our assumptions that it was rampant, but that they were on the books, and that we really figured out other ways to find recompense, to find a way to grant atonement to people without maiming them. Gets back a little bit to all this discussion right from where Barry picked that as the issue to bring as of now. We will a little bit more visit those issues as we see within this first chapter where the discussion of corporal punishment goes. Was it monetary already? Bobby asked straightforwardly. Well, the Gemara made it really clear that from a hekesh, from a gezerah shava, I mentioned Perek HaChovel and Bava Kama. I look at two words in two cases, and just like it's money over there, so too it's money over here. And I now close the system. And so even though the system says sometimes an eye for an eye, and I think that it's just going to continue a system of this kind of corporal punishment, what I really am talking about is already from a biblical time, an understanding that I do have an alternative mode of punishment and granting atonement, and that is through compensation. And already in certain cases in the Torah and around the Torah, if we were going through all the different legal cases that are outlined and what happens in inadvertent killings and when oxes gore and all the like, I see that money is very much on everybody's mind. And so what's the exact answer? I don't know. Professor Alter is, and points this out beautifully. None of the other commentators did. So in our time, we're a little bit more frank. The only instance where a person merited the punishment is when a man defames his wife. Now, I think that's pretty interesting in and of itself. And so keep the question open, but more than likely, we were going towards money than we were towards flogging and caning and lashes. And yet we're debating it because we want to know how to administer this law. Okay.
Can I just ask just one thing? Did I hear that correctly, that the Vilna Gaon actually enforced that? How could that be possible in the 18th century in Lithuania? Did they have their own authority to do that within the community?
Well, in certain places, you had a Beit Din that acted in accord with local authorities, and authorities looked the other way. Just on that topic, I don't know what you've read, Dale, but there's an expert on the Vilna Gaon, and his name is Rabbi Elijah Shochet, and talked a lot about some of those stories as being not necessarily as quote unquote non-fiction as some believe, but others do believe that he had some local control, just like some Batei Din, some Beit Dins had control over sending some folks out if men would not give gets to their wives, and they sent some big Jewish brutes out to really give it to the husbands who were recalcitrant. Dale, did you have a specific source in mind or a book that you had remember?
I have seen pictures. I've seen two different pictures of how it was done. One of them I have in a presentation that I can share.
That would be
the other
interesting.
one I can't find.
But let's just say that it's embroiled in scholarly investigation. Okay. Weiter. Let's continue on with a little text. I'm not going to get to my visuals that I thought, Bobby, but in 2 weeks, the next section has some lovely art. I just am promising everybody because it'll be our, off the page tangent. but I want to share a little bit more text before we take the break. You know, this week we're learning. Next week, we're not having class, but the week after we'll resume.
You were going to tell us about Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan as to why
Yeah. And I'm going to do that the next time as well, because they still hang out on our page. And and since we got into the study of lashes a little bit, I'm not going to do the whole Reish Lakish kind of thing just now. So I want to go back inside. Oh, hold on one second. No, that's not it. All right, hold on. Here we go. All right, so the continuation of the page, we hear from a scholar named Ula, Amar Ula. Remez la'edim zomamin min haTorah minayin. Where do we derive that the Torah understands that there's going to be a case of conspiring witnesses? Now, we read the Deuteronomy passage, but where do we know that the case is exactly like we're saying it is? That there are two witnesses who conspire with each other to try to implicate the third party, and that two other witnesses come and testify against them, and that we believe the testimony of the two witnesses that come and testify against them. And we then establish that the first two are conspiratorial witnesses. Remez la'edim zomamin min haTorah minayin, remez la'edim zaymamin, v'hach kativ. We know it's written, v'asitem lo ka'asher zamam. Because the Torah said you shall do to him exactly as he conspired to do, as he plotted to do, zamam, as he schemed to do, we obviously know that there was this case of edim zomamim in the Torah. Ela, remez la'edim zomamin shalokim min haTorah minayin. But furthermore, how do we know that we can give edim zomamin malchus? We can actually flog them and not only dish out the punishment that they hoped would be sentenced on the one they implicated. Minayin, where do we learn that it's possible to flog them? Dichtiv, it's written in the passage that was in consideration, the one we read from Deuteronomy, V'hitzdiku et hatzadik, v'hirshiu et harasha, v'haya in bin hakot harasha. So from these phrases, the Gemara here in Ula's name is going to learn that we have the actual case of conspiring witnesses. V'hitzdiku et hatzadik, they vindicated the righteous, condemned the wicked, and then the wicked is deserving of lashes. Mishum v'hitzdiku et hatzadik, because the two tzaddiks came, and we are seeing them, the second set of two witnesses, as being the ones who testified righteously against the first pair, which is represented by the plural word, v'hirshiu. We say that we can understand that the verse starts with the second pair of witnesses. That's who's hitzdiku. And what they did is they came and testified against the evil pair of witnesses, who we call them evil because they, ka'asher zamam, they conspired against a guy who's really innocent. And then what happens? After the tzaddiks came and told us what the evildoers did, we then say, like the Torah says, they are liable or deserving of lashes. Mishum v'hitzdiku et hatzadik, because the second pair of witnesses is considered righteous, and that they, in their righteousness, testified in court as to the falsification and the conspiracy that the pair of witnesses who testified at first testified. They hear shiu at the Russia, we absolutely condemn the pair of conspiring witnesses, and then v'hayayim bin Makkot harusha, and then we say that they're deserving of lashes. The Gemara is really, by bringing you this understanding of the progression of the verse, asking whether or not we can derive the punishment of lashes for Eidim Zomamim from here. The Torah is also asking us, not exactly literally in the Gemara, but the Gemara is asking us, can you see the way that we read this verse? Can you see the hint at our Eidim Zomamim case by saying the Hatzdiku et Hatzadik, that the tzaddik pair of witnesses, the second pair, came to say that the first pair were the Russia? And since they are Russia, and it says Russia down here, can't you see that we should give them lashes? Eila, let's look at it like this. Eidim shehir shiu et hatzadik, v'atu eidim acharine v'hitzdiku et hatzadik u'meikara v'shayin ve'hu lahane rishayim v'hayayim ben Makkot harusha. Rather, the verse is addressing the case of a witness who, through their testimony, condemned the righteous. In other words, yes, here it is. This is the way we read it. The ones who are the Russias condemned the righteous, and the other witnesses came and vindicated the original righteous person and rendered these first set of witnesses wicked. In the case, it shall be wicked is deserving of lashes, indicating that the lashes are an appropriate punishment for conspiring witnesses. And the Gemara is going to ask, do I need all of that kind of working out of the verses and understanding them exactly that way when I have a verse that says straightforwardly, "V'tepukle mi lotane," you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor? Why can't I just say, don't bear false witness against your neighbor? This was wrong. They transgressed a lo ta'aseh mitzvah. They transgressed the prohibition, and that prohibition is lo ta'aneh, one of the biggies from Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments. So why don't we use that one? Mishum dehave love she'ein bo ma'aseh, v'chol love she'ein bo ma'aseh ein lo kin alav. And now we get the straight up answer that we don't flog for violating that prohibition due to the fact that it is a prohibition that does not involve an action. They haven't come to court as a pair, testified in court as to the guilt of a third party. This lo ta'aseh, this lo ta'aneh, this thou shalt not bear false witness, is kind of the warning verse that says this is a big no-no. It's not representative of a case that was like these verbs back here in Deuteronomy were, that they did this, v'hitzdiku et hatzadik, v'hirshiu et harusha, v'haya. We know that the false witnesses case is only going to be when it involved the action. And for every prohibition that does not involve an action, one is not flogged for its violation. Now, you could say that falsification of testimony sounds like it was an action. But really what the Gemara is doing is it's saying there's one thing to have a lo ta'aseh mitzvah, which is a philosophical stance, a criminal law even that says don't do it. But then there was a case that they were found to actually falsify the testimony, conspire against a third party, and we had two witnesses come and say, no, it wasn't, because they were with us. And that in and of itself is the action. And then there's even a further discussion, as I mentioned, within the sources we already looked at, within the discussion we already looked at. But what if no real action took place, a la the kiyum, the establishing what those witnesses were trying to conspire about? What if there was no status change in the Kohen? What if there was no manslaughter and thusly no exile? I mean, can we really justify lashes? And so this question of how do we justify lashes definitely has an answer, because we see that there was a case where something really did happen. But on the other hand, it also gets us back to the question, can we really justify lashes in a case where nothing really happens? And that's kind of where we end with this section of the conversation. On to a continuation of whether or not we only have lashes as a possibility for administering punishments to Eidim Zomimi. We're going to get a different suggestion. This will take us into the next part of the Gemara. I'll do a little bit about Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, just because they were the first ones mentioned, and it is very interesting. And since the next part is going to deal with matters of a woman's status vis-a-vis marriage, we get into a whole different area of law that we get to explore as well. So what's happening for us is that we're getting a little Kohenic reflection on Kohenic systems. We're getting now a little reflection on the manslaughter laws, and we're going to move into some of the issues that come up with marriage as well. All right, folks.